You made a good point that you can't measure mental fatigue, which makes it difficult and makes your job quite challenging, I guess, as well.
It does, and I think just listening back to the interview there with Chris, and I'm very lucky to have a trusting line manager. Um, in 2012, I was at a sports conference, sports science conference in London, and I think it was Nick Beard said that the next breakthrough in sports science, he said, and he thought, was to trust your gut instinct, and that was in 2012. And sometimes we can underestimate, I think, and undervalue the, if we've been around a few years, and you can tell I have, that you can underestimate just how good your gut instinct can be when you meet people who you know or even don't know. Because I've always thought it was incapable of lying to you, your gut instinct. So if you marry that with data and science information and the expertise which is around all of football these days, if you can still have the courage to trust your eyes and your ears and what you see and what you feel, I don't think you should be ashamed or embarrassed to use that or say that. I really don't. And that might go against the trend in a very data-driven era, but it's still a vital piece of information to use.
Because Tony and Scott touched on this. I think in football now there is people want everything to be measured, and to have data for everything. So that makes the challenge even harder, I would think.
Absolutely, it does, and that's why. And maybe it was a weird experience watching myself on Zoom interview my own line manager. But what happened last Friday when we recorded it, once our game was called off, is the kindly Kieran, who was recording it for us at Brentford, he was meant to leave the room and go and do something else, but he didn't, because he found himself listening to some of the answers from Chris. Because even though he's at the training ground every day and recording the interviews and taking the pictures and doing the social media content, I think that he found some new information in that, because he didn't know sometimes how we all think and feel when we go around a day's training. Because I'm certainly, I've got no embarrassment to say this. I don't have a fixed position. I don't have a desk. I certainly don't have an office. I just tend to float. I mean, I think they joke at me, the staff, that I just float around trying to pick up all those bits of information which they may not pick up because they're doing their very specific and important job. So I try and pick up all the bits and use those instincts to help them prepare the players.
Yeah, excellent. And Richmond Stace has asked a question here. He says, do you view mental recovery as separate from physical recovery? And that is something that struck me today, how everything is kind of linked. It seems to me. I don't know what you think.
If I was to give it a binary answer, no, because I think the physical and the mental side are intertwined in every single way. You can't just have one without the other. So I'd like to think also in the way in which we work at Brentford, and how I work with Chris and all the staff and science and coaching, it's very much intertwined in every way, Richmond. So I wouldn't regard them as separate. Well, that's my area. I think that they're too closely linked for that.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, and then I mean, we talked obviously about sleep, nutrition. You could even bring in things like breathing, and it seems they are all interconnected.
They are, and they're not new techniques. Sleep's been around a long time. I think if we go back over the history of the human race, and I know in my life, I was brought up in a family which was in a different generation. I accept that, but sleep was the number one priority. That was both for learning, for school, for exams, even for holidays and Christmas. If you were well rested, you could learn better, pass an exam better. So when I was able to join forces with Anna West, who, by the way, I thought was excellent earlier today, everything begins and finishes with a good night's sleep. And you can put everything else around it, but at the center of it, the core of it is sleep. And again, the facts and figures now coming from the research, and Anna said it this morning, that if you don't need sleep, you're just part of 1% of the world's population, because we all need sleep, including athletes, including staff. So sleep for me is the absolute beginning and the end of recovery, physical recovery and mental recovery. And I think if you use that as your starting point and build around it, you'll have a good chance. And I mean, how the players and staff get by sometimes in this season, the amount of travelling and night games and lack of rest is extraordinary. The intensity has been incredible, considering the schedule and the amount of travel everyone's done this season.
Yeah. And there seems to be very good cohesion between the disciplines at Brentford. How is that achieved? Because I know it's not always the case at every club.
No, it's the third club I've been at, and I mean, I like football more than like football, and I think that some of the participants I've met in it, both players and staff, have been really of the very highest level. But I was thinking about that, luckily, and I didn't know that question was going to come in, Simon. I think a lot of us have been there quite a long time, and I think in certain sports and certain football clubs, you can have a high turnover of staff, and I understand why. I think we go back to the Fergie days of keep you on your toes and mix it up every 2 years. But I was speaking to our lead S&C coach yesterday because I do a lot of floating, and he's been there 9 years, and he doesn't recognise his job from when he arrived to where it is now. The club has developed in those 9 years, and we've all been there quite a long time. Even I've been there 4 years, which is often a long time in football. So I think we've got to know each other. I think we've got to trust each other and trust each other's methods. And I've got some strengths, which I bring. I've also got some horrendous weaknesses also. So I think we've understood each other's very good ways of working and our weaknesses too. So we're not embarrassed to admit what we're good at and what we're not so good at. But there's a real element of trust and stability there as well, I hope.
Yeah, excellent. And one very interesting thing you talked about that stood out for me was about the playfulness and Michael Beale's tips about that. And we've actually got a question on that. Michael Mackin. He said, are there any particular exercises or tips you could give about playfulness?
Well, it's well timed because Rangers have won their first Scottish title, and Mick Beale was, who I've known for a long time, Mick. Again, with different generations, with different backgrounds, and when I saw him present in Belfast, where I sometimes do some work with Mick, he spoke about his time in Sao Paulo and how Brazilian South American players, they need a lot of playfulness in their training schedule to keep them engaged, because it can get very functional. And Chris mentioned it there about they've developed 2 or 3 of their own, 3 or 4 of their own leagues now with the training environment. Luckily, and this is one of the benefits of COVID, we've built or have a temporary structure, which is a sort of it's an indoor gym, but it's built as a I just call it the biggest gazebo gym in the world. And the players there have taken up 2-touch, which improves their skill. Head tennis, again, all within COVID regulations, because we've been, again, the staff have been magnificent on managing COVID. So we've had head tennis, we've had 2-touch tennis, and we've got stand-up. I mean, Chris mentioned it, stand-up Jenga. Now, I've recorded a couple of games of this Jenga, and we all stand 2 meters apart, and you walk in to pull your brick out. The level of competition in a game of stand-up Jenga, I can assure you, which is playfulness, is extraordinary. And even one game which I recorded, you could even see how, dare I say it, the goalkeepers were very methodical in which brick they pulled out. The defenders and central midfielders were quite thoughtful around it. In came the centre forwards and just pulled out the first brick they saw, and down went the pile. But we will use any form of, or they want to, they can invent games which keep them moving, interested, and engaged, because as I mentioned there in the interview, and I say this with no embarrassment, as much as I love football, and I still get the most extraordinary buzz going into work in football, it can get very monotonous. The week can look very much the same. And I've worked in a number of sports. The week is very structured. There's not much room for breathing and, dare I say it, doing your own thing. So the more they can do that within the regulations, without exhausting themselves, without doing something stupid or injuring themselves, I think is important, and it keeps them interested and engaged, because boredom, I think, does play a role in football, because if you just do the same thing every day with the same people, with the same voice and the same tracksuit and the same gym, with the same bike and the same mat, that can get tedious, and we've got to keep people fresh, particularly in COVID.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that's very interesting, because I remember I did a piece early on about a day in the life of a footballer at Norwich. And I was amazed how often they were getting monitored and how many tests they had to do from when they first walked in. So I guess this is a place where they're not having to actually perform and be monitored if they're playing Jenga, you know.
Well, if I can be very brave, I've yet to meet any professional athlete in my life, in my career, from horse racing to darts and everything in between. I've yet to meet the athlete who said, I've come into this because I couldn't wait to get tested, or a fat test, or a bleep test. Now, of course, they want to get fit and they want to get healthy, and they love the scientific side in it. But I wrote an article this morning about this. As a 10-year-old boy, you didn't dream, or girl, you didn't dream of your latest body mass index test or your latest team meeting. You don't. You don't come to sport for that. You come to sport to get better, to master it, to play it, to either conquer the world as an individual or to be part of a team. And it was Mick Beale again. I really put a huge emphasis on engagement and playfulness in sport still. Otherwise, it just becomes a functional scientific experiment, and it is not. Football isn't just a simple binary functional scientific experiment played on Zoom, thankfully.
No. I'm struggling to think of another profession actually where they're as surveyed and as monitored and scrutinized as footballers, to be honest.
Well, I've spent much of the winter in an international rugby bubble, and I can assure you they are just as monitored, measured, in every single way. And that's more of a game of set plays. I mean, football still, despite the beauty of that lovely VAR system, football is still a free-flowing, fast-moving game. Rugby is still that, but there are more set plays with scrums and lineouts, rugby league also, NFL. So across all sports, we want to have that edge. We're always looking for that edge. And what's been fascinating for me through COVID, both for good and bad, is sport for a while was completely stripped bare. It went back to its absolute raw basics. That's what I was writing about this morning, Simon, because all the luxuries went. The ice baths went, the cryotherapy chambers went, eating together went, showering went, absolutely everything went. And we brought it back to its real core basics. And that was management of people. And that was athletes also, dare I say it, working it out for themselves. And certainly at Brentford, I think at many clubs, the figures being returned, the data on the level of intensity of games is extraordinary. And when they came back from the first lockdown, I think we're into number 3 now, they came back as fit, I think, as we've ever known them, really. And yet we hadn't been with them for 7 weeks because they took it upon themselves, with the online support, of course, to work out how best to recover and also to train themselves. And sometimes I think we want to overtrain, not in terms of the amount we can overtrain them, but almost over-monitor and oversee them. But these are pretty free-spirited, independent people. And if we're micromanaged in any walk of life, if we are absolutely micromanaged, I think it can wear us all out. So giving them some freedom and independence is no bad thing.
Yeah, definitely. And taking the Jenga again as an example, when was that actually brought in? Was that in response to COVID?
No, I think it's one of the games, and I use the word lightly, games they've had in the past, and it's not the sit down version. That the bricks are the size of cricket bats, really, and so you can keep your distance and you can do it outside as well. But it's just one of those games in which they want to be engaged in, and I think that if you watch the end of any training session at any football club, and of course we don't want to overtrain, particularly at the moment with the amount of possible injuries which could come the last 12 games of the season. I watched the players train yesterday. Once the session was finished, they wanted to stay behind and play outside, because I think the vast majority of them came into football because they played it in the park, in the street, at school, with their mates, with their families. And I spend far too much time looking at footage online of some of the world's best players still who came from that playful background. And they want to play and they want to practice their skills and they want to have little competitions. And we shouldn't stop that just because there isn't a booklet saying, what's the benefit of that? The mental benefit could be immeasurable, and it brings them together. And one of the nicest things I saw this season were the Spurs players from across the world, their very diverse squad, playing indoor cricket with Joe Hart sending down a nice little medium pace for 85 miles an hour and nipping Harry Kane's off stump. And some of the players, they've never heard of cricket, taking a catch-up mid-on. It just was playful, and it helps bring people together. And it just keeps us engaged because it can get very monotonous otherwise.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I was interested again that Chris said you'd done the saliva testing on whether they were better having a recovery day at home or at the training ground. And it was better at the training ground because the players ate better, moved about more, etc. But that they still allowed the players to have the rest day at home because of the mental recovery there could be in that factor and a different environment. So that's an example, again, of getting away from the data, I guess, and the science and making a common sense decision.
Well, dare I say it, because we've all, and I know we've been very lucky in sport, particularly I've been very lucky as well, be able to still go to work with all the protocols and testing. And I've been in 3 different bubbles in the last year, but the vast majority of the population have been at home, either with their families, with their children. If you live on your own, you've got my genuine sympathies, because loneliness is a desperate in its own right. But if you've been at home for the best part of the last 11 months, particularly since Christmas until the schools opened on Monday, let's not be too polite about this. We're fed up at the sight of each other, because we've been looking at the same thing every day, the same people every day. There hasn't been a lot of new news happening, because no one's really left the house, other than, which I hope they have been, to exercise. And we want to get out again to see things and be stimulated. So if you're just coming in every day and seeing the same thing every day and the same people every day, that can make you very stale, and that can turn you off. So again, I think, as all football clubs are, but we're driven and led by the latest information. But sometimes you've got to say, no, they need time away just to refresh themselves. Otherwise, it can all get a little bit too much, because you just see the same things and the same people every day. And that's not healthy. No matter what the information says, that's probably not very healthy.
No. And that's quite brave, I suppose, to move away from the science. I was just wondering what the kind of decision-making process would have been there, and who would have made that decision.
That would have been Chris's team. That would have been the medical department and the coaches also. I mean, I must stress, I'm talking above my pay grade here. I'm not in every day, as Chris said. It's roughly one day every 7 to 8 or 9 days. So no decision is taken there in isolation. I think what I've learned, and it's been very good to see, is that every decision is taken from the coaching side, the medical side, and the scientific side. It's not just, I've got an idea and here's the decision. It's taken as a group, not as individuals.
Yeah, excellent. And just as a final one, a lot of us have enjoyed your missives about your walk with your dog, Shankly, who sadly passed away. Was it last week or the week before?
It's actually 2 weeks ago today. 2 weeks ago today, the old, and that Shankly was well named, because he never walked alone, apart from when he ran off. And yes, he was a major part. I think people came to see me because of him, not because of me. That's for sure.
And there was a nice story there, wasn't there, again with Brentford, because football clubs and footballers can get a bad press. But there was something very nice they did, wasn't there, for you when they heard about that?
Yeah, you'll never find me giving football or footballers a bad press, because it's given me too much pleasure in my life. But yeah, old Shankly, he often would accompany me, as I think he did at Middlesbrough, he did at Hull, because he lived to a good age. And he would just be put in the back of my car, and I'd leave him in the corner of the training ground. And more often than not, after training, a member of staff, a coach, a player, the managers, Dean Smith, Thomas Frank, would say, come on, Michael, go and grab Shanks, we'll go for half an hour's walk. And I found that on those walks in sport, because there were no barriers, no furniture, no offices, no titles, the very, very, very best conversations took place. And Shanks was a big part of that football club. I think many of the players knew their dog better more than they knew me. And then I went in last week, a week after he died well, by the way, because he had a wonderful life, and then off he went quickly. I walked in last week, and waiting for me on arrival was a presentation of the shirt behind me here, a frame shirt with his name on, signed by all the staff and players, with a number 14 to recognise the number of years in the back. And if they'd given me, I promise you, a Ferrari that day, or a huge suitcase of money or anything, it would not mean as much, which now hangs over there, as that shirt's given me by the club. So that's the human side of it. And maybe that encapsulated what I hope we stand for as much as anything. It was the most lovely gesture.
Yeah, fantastic. That's what I was actually going to say. What shone through is looking after the human being, whether it's a player, a member of staff, yourself. That's what's really shone through, and with that story as well.
That, if I may say so, I'm probably going to, whoever's left on this webinar, I'm going to lose you all now. That's what I call the really good side of old school coaching people and the rest of it, because we can get so focused on the information and doing our job, you forget behind everyone and everything is some degree of story. I mean, there's players at the moment living on their own through COVID. We've got a couple in a hotel. I could not think of anything worse than living in a hotel initially. Put a bit of COVID in, and I could be anything more wretched than living in a hotel in isolation. So behind every footballer, and I use this line for the last 6 years, I heard it said 6 years ago, There's a living, breathing, emotional human being. They are not performance tools. They're not our performance tools, and they're not our scientific experiments. In their own right, they are living, breathing, emotional human beings, as you and I are too.
Yeah, definitely. Well, that's brilliant. Thank you, Michael. Really
No,
enjoyed.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. I hope you all had a good day.
Yeah.